Can grab a seat. Yeah, like Pastor said at the beginning, my name is Jordan. I'm one of the Agape college director here, so get to work with our college students, which is super fun. I want to welcome you guys, obviously, for some of you that are here, but also those of you online. It's just good to be in this space, and I know we're kind of doing this like Bible study discussion on YouTube, and so I'm just going to ask you guys, if you are on YouTube right now, there's going to be moments where we're having discussion here in the room. And so you guys, you get to message things in the chat, and you guys get to be this virtual community tonight. And so I challenge you guys to do that tonight, because that'll be fun to actually have some interaction online that way. So we're just going to kind of jump into things. And I tend to, when I talk really fast. So for those in the room, if I'm talking too fast, just give me a little like, slow down, Jordan. I also walk around a lot, so hopefully I won't walk around too much so we actually stay in frame. But no, excited to be here and excited to dig into what it means to be faithful. And as we've concluded our series on the Joshua generation and what it means to journey into promise. And like Pastor said, we're now starting this kind of 3 weeks of talking through what does it mean to be faithful to the things that God has called us to, and specifically what does it look like. Last week or 2 weeks ago, Pastor talked about God's faithfulness to us. And last week on Sunday, we just talked about our response to God's faithfulness, of what it looks like for us to be faithful. And so that's kind of where I want to go tonight, is unpacking even more of what does it mean to be faithful? What does our own faithfulness look like? And so we'll have some teaching, we'll have some discussion, and see where God takes us. So I want to start off here. I'm going to throw up this picture of this individual. This person, his name is Lynn Thurkelson, kind of a funny name. So this is an individual. As I start off, I want to tell a story about someone who I think is a good definition of faithful, someone who was faithful in their life. And this individual was born in Denver, Colorado, and then later moved to Iowa in life. And so he kind of grew up on a farm, didn't have a lot of money, grew up in the times actually of the Great Depression. And so this individual, I remember hearing stories of just how hard it was living in that time, of not having a lot, of trying to just make it through the everyday moments, and how life was a struggle and life was hard. Later in life, he moved to California, is actually living a little bit from here in Long Beach, California, and so kind of was doing life there, ended up meeting his eventual wife there, and they started a family. It was kind of at the times trying to figure out a career for himself, and so he decided that he was going to enlist in the Army Air Corps, actually, before there actually was an Air Force. And so as the tail end of World War II is when he enlisted in the Army Air Corps, and served faithfully in the military, ended up serving in the Korean War, and eventually de-enlisted and kind of got out, retired the beginning of the Vietnam War, and so spent kind of his whole career and his whole life in the military. And when I hear stories about this individual, right, Lynn Thurkelson, he was a family man. He was someone, he had 4 kids, and he grew up and he raised them, and it was kind of one of these things of, he spent a lot of his time devoted to his family. He spent a lot of time also devoted to his country, obviously in the armed forces and serving. And after retirement, he ended up starting a Christian bookstore as kind of this way of this retirement job, but also this way to give back to the community that he was in. And he was an elder at the church that he was a part of, and so he was this lay ministry leader who was helping lead the people around him. And he was someone who was never just this dynamic, effective person that has this huge ministry that we all hear about. And yet he was someone, I think, who was just very obedient and faithful in the everyday moments of life. And I kind of paint this picture of this individual because I want us to think about the everyday moments of faithfulness. You can take this picture down, that way online people can see. But as you see this picture of this individual, as you see Lynn Thurkelson up on the screen there, it's this definition for me of, I think, what everyday faithfulness is. Pastor Soon kind of walked through the life of Abraham this past Sunday, and Abraham's faithfulness, and Abraham's response to God, and Abraham's obedience to God. And I want to take a moment here, just as we're kind of in this room in discussion time, and I want us to think of someone in your life who is a picture of faithfulness to you. Okay, so I want to take a moment. We're going to break out into just kind of each side of the room, kind of groups here. We can kind of talk a little bit. And so turn to the people next to you. And I want you guys to think of, get an image in your head of someone in your life. Maybe it's someone you know, maybe it's someone you've heard about who is faithful. And talk about what are the characteristics in their life that made them a faithful person? What is it that you admire in their faithfulness? Okay, and so take a moment, turn to each other. I'll give you about 5 or so minutes and just kind of think of someone who's faithful. That Lynn Thurkelson, right? Maybe it's not this big, huge moment, but it's just the everyday faithfulness. And talk about what is it that characterized them as faithful in your life. So take a moment. If you're on the chat as well online on YouTube, you guys can kind of write in the comments of someone who's faithful that you recognize as being faithful. So take a moment. I'll bring us back in a little bit. But who's someone who's been faithful in your life and what made them faithful? All right, I'm going to bring us back. Maybe you're sharing some stories still. Wherever you're at, right? All of you probably at some point right now, you have an image in your head of the person or the individual you described as being faithful. And I want to kind of leave that as a reference for you as we're kind of going through this talk, and we're talking about what does it look like for us to be faithful. right? I think we're surrounded by people in our lives who have been faithful. And again, just kind of recapping what we talked about on Sunday, right? Pastor Soon very beautifully walked us through what does it look like for us to respond to God's faithfulness and be faithful in our own lives. And we talked about what that is and what that means. And he kind of brought up specifically he walked us through Hebrews chapter 11. And it's this passage of faith, and it's this moment where the author here is describing Abraham's faithfulness. He's describing Abraham as being this man who was obedient to God and was faithful to God and heard from God and lived into that. And tonight I want to talk about what does that actually look like for us? What does that look like for us as a church, UPC, to be faithful with what God has called us to? What does it look like to practically and actually step into faithfulness? I want us to think individually too, what does that mean for you personally to step into faithfulness? To live into a life of being faithful? To live into and embody some of these characters of that individual we just thought of an individual, a person who lived faithfully. In Pastor Soon's sermon on Sunday, he kind of gave this definition of faithful, and I thought it was really good. And so he said, being faithful means to be loyal, devoted, with allegiance towards God. Faithfulness is the motive for obedience, where we obey God because we love God. He said faithfulness is the motive for obedience. And when I heard this, I thought it was really interesting, right? Of this idea of our faithfulness, and that our faithfulness is motivated by our obedience to God. And so as we're talking about faithfulness, I think we also need to talk about obedience. And what does it mean to be obedient to the things that God has called us to? If you guys have your Bibles, you can pull it up on your phone too. We're going to be looking at 1 John chapter 5 to kind of talk about faithfulness and obedience. And when Pastor Soon talked about that our faithfulness is the motive behind obedience, he brought up this passage of 1 John chapter 5. And it's this passage where John, the author here, is talking to the church, to this new group of believers, of what does it mean to want to experience love and to experience God's love. And he has this statement towards the end of this. And it's 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, and it says this. It says, "For the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." For the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments. Right, and as Pastor said, if faithfulness is the motive for obedience, then I think we have to pay attention when John says that we are to obey God's commandments. That part of faithfulness means to be obedient. Which then poses the question, if faithfulness is motivated by obedience, right, then we have to be obedient to something. And as 1 John says here, that we are to be obedient to the command of God, the command that God has given us. Which then poses the question, well, then what is this command that we are supposed to follow? And so I want us to, again, it's Bible study tonight, right? It's discussion. It's not just me talking. It's us digging into the Word of God and learning on our own, right? So I want us to unpack, and I want us to think through what is it, this commandment that we are then to obey. So again, I'm going to have us turn into groups. And again, if you're online, maybe you spend some time and you open the passage right now and you start looking for yourself. And there's two different parts right here in 1 John where John actually says this is what the commandment of God is that we're to follow. And so we're just going to backtrack and we're going to rewind here. As John said that our love for God is in our obedience to God's command. We're going to rewind and look at, well, what is that command that John says God has given us? Okay, so half of the room here, the first time where John mentions in his book here, this letter, about what this command is in 1 John 3:23. So this side, your guys' passage is 1 John 3, verse 23, okay? Second part where it says what this command is that we are supposed to obey is just before this in 1 John chapter 4, verse 21. And so this side of the room, you guys have 1 John chapter 4, verse 21. And what I want you guys to do is I want you to break up into groups and I want you to open the passage. There's Bibles in the back if you want a hard copy Bible too to kind of look at. And I want you to turn to this passage, whichever side of the room you're on. If you're online, you can just pick one of the two, okay, and look at it. And I want you to answer a few things. One, what is the context of this verse? Okay, don't just read the verse, kind of read what's around the verse, kind of unpack a little bit, see what the context of this verse is. Then I want you with your groups to kind of discuss what do you think is the main point of this passage that you just read? And lastly, what is the command that is given in this passage, okay? So, again, I'm going to break you guys off. Turn to each other, dig into your individual passages. This side you got 1 John 3, that verse. This side you got 1 John 4. Take some time. I'm going to have you guys kind of share what you learn in a little bit, okay? So talk about it. It's up there if you need prompts with it. But see, what is the commandment that God has given us to obey? I'm going to bring us back Again, if you're online and you maybe saw some stuff in the chat, you can kind of see what other people said here too. And we're just going to kind of now, again, have a moment where we're going to have each group just kind of share what the command actually was, right? So as we just read, right, it said, for the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. And now we just split up to say, okay, well, what is this commandment then that 1 John says is the commandment that we are to obey? So group one, unfortunately you're group one, so you're first. Briefly, if someone wants to just summarize what your verse was, remember 1 John 3, verse 23, what that command was in there, kind of what the main synopsis you guys came up with there. So if someone from your group wants to share what the commandment was there and the main point of it. So for those of you online, maybe didn't hear it, the verse basically said that this is the commandment, is to believe in God and to love others. And they described a whole before this in this chapter 3, basically John describing this is what it looks like to love each other. So that was them. Okay, group two, same thing. What was the command that was given? What was a little bit of context? What was your main point? Whoever wants to share. Bill, you're being put on the spot. What do you got for us? Super, again, kind of the summation of that, right? And John says here, the command is this, to love one another, right? To love your brothers and sisters, and with this brotherly family love. And they just kind of describe, what this looks like of this isn't burdensome because we've received God's love, and in kind of the context of that a little bit. And so, right, with both of these groups, right, we kind of talked about, and we see that as John is saying here that the love of God is to obey his commandment. And we saw here what is the commandment, and it's kind of twofold, right? Your guys has kind of left out the first part, but it's in this part, right? The first part is to believe God. And I love it as I was kind of thinking, as I was wrestling through this, of what does it mean to believe God? And I think to believe in God, I think is different than just to know about God. Right? I think believing and knowing are a little bit different. And I think we see here in this text and in this passage is John is saying that the first part of this command is to believe in God. And part of our faithfulness, if faithfulness is the motive of obedience, then part of our obedience is to believe in God. And recognizing that I think believing is more than just a knowledge of who God is. It's not just a logic or a cerebral sense of who God is, but it's an all-inclusive sense of who God is. It's not just our logic in our heads, but it's also our hearts and our emotions and our feelings. It's kind of the sense, right, of when Jesus says that we're to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. It's not just with our mind of knowing who God is. That's part of it, but it's all-encompassing. It's believing in our hearts and in our actions and in our soul, in the very core of who we are, believing in God. And so I think the question I want us to wrestle through is, one, what is the difference between knowing God and believing in God? And for you personally, what does it look like to believe in God? To believe in his promises, to believe in his truths, to believe in his presence in our life. And maybe we've grown up and we've heard these things. For me, I grew up in church, and so I know who God is, and I know that God is present, I know that God is faithful, but it's completely different to know that and then to step and to live into that faithfulness. To truly believe that the God that I've read in Joshua who led the people, and the God that I saw in Abraham's story who allowed a sacrifice instead of his own son, right? That truly did make him as numerous as the stars of the universe. To hear those stories and know those stories, but then to actually live and to believe that. And John is saying part of the commandment is to believe in God. To put our faith and our hope and our trust, not just in the things that we know, but in the things that we live out in our heart, mind, soul, and strength kind of believe. And so that's part one of the command. And part two of the command then is to love each other. Right? To love each other. And as you guys both very eloquently, both groups kind of talked about if we see this love is demonstrated in God's own love for us. And you guys both talked about, as you kind of looked at the context that this command was given of, this context is given in the command of God's love for us. That we're able to love other people because of God's model for us. And so again, backpedaling, we're talking about what is it like for us to be faithful. And if faithfulness is motivated by obedience, and the command we're called to be obedient to is to believe in God and to love others, then the question below that becomes, well, how do we even step into this? How do we step into this act of obedience and obeying this command that God has given us? Again, John gives us kind of a hint and a clue of what this looks like throughout the whole rest of the book, right? And it's this word love. Right, and love kind of, I'm sure you probably know, right? It's the agape love is the word for love here. And this word love is actually used 46 times in the whole book of 1 John here. Between chapter 2 and chapter 5, 46 times, John uses this word love. He uses it over and over and over and over again. 46 times he uses the word love, right? 28 of these are the verb form of love here, right? So it's this active love. It's this action of love. The other 18 are the noun form of agape here, which is this presence of love, right? And it's this description of what love is. And so for 46 times, John says this is what it looks like to step into and obey this command is love. And like you guys talked about, it starts with God's love for us. That we can't fully comprehend and acknowledge and accept love until we begin to recognize the depth of love that God has for us. That before we can begin to step into loving other people, I think we first have to understand God's love for us personally. And John kind of makes this known in 1 John chapter 4, verse 10. He says, not that we love God, but that God first loved us. As he's talking about love, he says, it's not that we love God, but that God first loved us. And so love starts with the idea of we first have to acknowledge and accept and see God's love in our own lives. He says it again just 9 verses later, 1 John chapter 4, verse 19, it says, we love because he, God, first loved us. We love because we were first loved. And you guys talk about, I heard you talk about in a discussion, and maybe you guys got there a little bit, right? But John gives this context of this, right? Of God sending his only son to this earth to give his life, to give his most beloved, treasured possession as an act of love. And it says that we can love not first, but only because of God's love for us. And that is what motivates and leads us into loving others. And I think it's fascinating that John, right, the author of this book is, in church tradition believes, right, is John is the one who is writing to this church of believers, that he's the one who can describe this, and he's encouraging the church with this message, right? And ultimately it's a message of faithfulness because it's talking about obedience and obeying the command, and the command is to believe in God and to love others. And I think John is in a place to actually encourage the church with this because I think John has actually experienced God's love. I think he's experienced firsthand the love of God incarnate, Jesus, God's Son on earth. Tradition kind of has it, right, that the guy who's writing 1 John here is the one who wrote the Gospel of John. And I want to rewind and I want to go back to this passage in the book of John, the Gospel of John, to understand what John's relationship to Jesus was. Because just like we talked about the difference between knowing God and believing in God, that I think John had an experience where he didn't just know who Jesus was, but he actually got to experience firsthand in his heart and his head and his actions and his mind, soul, and strength who Jesus was to him. That he was able to encourage the church to love because he was first loved by Jesus. Right, and so I want to look at, if you guys want to turn there, you can. It's in John chapter 13. Right, and this is kind of, again, the Gospel of John, this recording of who Jesus' life was. And as John is writing this and recording this, again, the common kind of through tradition and history is that John, the disciple of Jesus, is the author here of John and recounting his time in his life with Jesus. And in chapters 13 through 17, it's kind of this final moment of Jesus' life where he's having this moment with his disciples, his 12 closest followers and best friends. And they're sitting, right? And Jesus, he knows what's about to happen. He knows the cross is in front of him. He knows his final hours on earth are just around the corner. And this is his final discourse and his final moment to encourage and to say to his disciples, his friends, his closest followers, hey, this is what it looks like to receive my love, to believe in me, and to now go love one another. And there's this interesting kind of phrase, again, as they're sitting around this table that depicts John, the believed author of the Gospel of John, in a really interesting light. It's John chapter 13, and it's verse 23, kind of through 25, and then they're sitting here, and it says, one of Jesus' disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to Jesus. Right, and it starts off here, and it's giving this depiction, right? They're sitting, and Jesus is speaking, and he's teaching them, and it says that one of Jesus' disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, and you probably know, right? This phrase is used often in the book of John to describe who we think is John, the author of this, the disciple of John, the one whom Jesus loved. And it's this phrase in the statement of belovedness. It's kind of this special indication of love. And I think as you look at this even a little bit deeper, this is so cool, okay? And it says that the one whom Jesus loved, and it says was reclining next to Jesus. Other translations kind of say, kind of the original context is to lean against Jesus' chest or to lean against his bosom is kind of the more accurate description of what this would have been. And it's this posture of closeness. I think we get a greater sense of what this word even means going back to John chapter 1, verse 18. John is writing the relationship between God the Father and his son Jesus. And it says this, and it says, it's God's only Son who is so close to God's own heart, who has made him known to us. And the same phrase that Jesus, who is close to God's own heart, is kind of the same phraseology and the same term here that's used for John leaning against the chest of Jesus, right, is close to the heart of Jesus. And so John is experiencing this closeness to Jesus. Many people think, again, tradition kind of has it that John was kind of the little brother of the group. He was kind of the youngest in the group. No one knows his exact age, but he was probably an upper teenager, lower 20s. And so he was kind of this figure that people kind of think was kind of tagging along and was this kind of beloved little brother figure, right? That was kind of with and got to experience firsthand the love of Jesus. And it's in this context that I think John very purposely and very presently experienced God's love for him. Day in and day out, he knew what it was to experience God's love and to know God's love. And because of that, to believe in God's love. And because of that, to speak to the church years later, this is the commandment that you are to obey. Well, later on, just a few verses down in John 14:5, you'll probably recognize these words, right? Jesus is speaking again to his disciples, and it says, if you love me, Jesus says, you will keep my commandments. Right? Copy, paste that into 1 John, right? And in John 14, verse 5, Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. If you love me, you will obey me. And so John is hearing these words, and it continues, and Jesus says, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another, an advocate to be with you forever. You will know him because he remains with you. Right? And so Jesus gives us to command them. He says, if you love me, you will obey me. The same command we read in 1 John that John is giving to the church. And he says, you will know that this command is with you because I'm going to send my Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the advocate, to be with you and to lead you. And there's this phrase here that says, because he's going to remain, or some of you probably see the translation, he's going to abide with you. And abide is kind of where we get the same word abode, right? It's kind of this place of dwelling and presence, and right, to abide is to be present with someone, to be with someone, to remain. It says that the Spirit is going to remain, is going to abide with us. I think it's super interesting that John, as he's writing this command to believe and to obey God's commands, says the same words that were spoken to him as he was this beloved follower of Jesus who was experiencing God's love firsthand. And this same phrase, abide, is used time and time again in 1 John's letter to the church as well. We saw that love is the word that's used the most, 46 times, and we see second to that is the word abide, which is used 24 times in the book of 1 John. And so this phrase, abide, is something that is special and is meaningful to John because I think he's experienced it firsthand. In the same way that it's over and over again in this letter of 1 John, right after it talks about abiding in the love of God and what that means, Jesus too uses this word abide a lot in the same passage we were just reading. In the next 22 verses, this word abide or remain is used 11 times. And Jesus in the same way is encouraging them, if you love me, you will obey me. And that's followed up then with, this is what it looks like to be able to live into that. It's to remain in my love, to abide, to abode, to make your home in God's love. And so backpedaling, as Pastor Soon said, right, if faithfulness is the motive for obedience, right, if our obedience helps demonstrate our faithfulness, and as we read here that our obedience, we're obeying this command to believe in God and to love the people around us. And the question is then, how do we experience that? And we experience that love because God has first loved us. And at the root of all of that is this idea of remaining and abiding and abiding and staying in the home of God's love. So as we track down this funnel, right, and we talk about faithfulness, we get to this moment at the bottom of it starts with remaining in God's love. That our faithfulness can be acted out because we are remaining, we are abiding, we are abiding, we are staying in the home of God's love. And so I want to just kind of wrap up, well, then what does it look like for us very practically and very tangibly to remain in God's love? And it's this famous passage, right, that gets talked about a lot, and it's John chapter 15. And it's when Jesus is saying to his disciples, and he says, this is what it means to remain. And he gives this analogy of the vine and the branches. And he says, you are to remain in me, and just as I am with you, that the Father is in you because I love you. He says, apart from me, you can do nothing. And Jesus gives this imagery, as he often does, right, of everyday things, of a vineyard, of vines and branches, and remaining in God's love. I was listening to this morning a sermon where some guy was talking about this passage, and he was kind of describing what a vineyard is, right, and what a vine dresser actually is, and the process that would have actually taken him for the people in that day and age, what this would have meant to them. And he was describing how the vine branch was actually, the grape branch was actually the national symbol of Israel. And so it would have been this thing that was part of Israel's history. And again, kind of like we have the bald eagle, right? The grapevine would have kind of been their symbol that they would have remembered. Right? It's when Moses sent Joshua and Caleb into the promised land and they came back and said they came bringing back these big stems of grapes, right? And it was this symbol of the promise that we've been talking about this whole last couple months. And so Jesus, in the same way, is using this symbol that would have been familiar to them. And as I was listening to this guy talk about what it actually means to be a vine dresser, right? He was talking about how these grapevines, how they grow, right? And they have no problem growing. They grow in every direction, and they're intertwined, and they're intertangled, and they're all meshed together. And he says the vine dresser's job is he go around, he spends hours going to each and every single little vine that's coming out of the main stalk of branches, and he looks at them, and he looks for little imperfections, and he looks for the moments where it looks like it's going to be weak, so that when the rain comes or the wind comes, he says this one isn't going to sustain it, so he cuts it off, so that the rest of the energy can come from that main stem to the other strong stems. And this tangled up weave of branches then becomes this narrowed, focused vine and branches shooting out of that aren't cluttered, that aren't scattered, and yet it's purposeful. And then as I think we learn that we have to trust the pruning. That part of remaining in God's love means we have to trust the pruning. We have to trust the moments where God is cutting off little pieces of us because he says, I know when things get hard, when things get tough, that you're too distracted and that's taking you away from my love and from my presence in your life and from what I'm leading you into. Or if I'm honest and I look at my life and it's busy and it's chaotic and there's branches scattered on branches and this overwhelming mess sometimes, right? And the pressures of work and the pressures of stuff at home and the pressures of relationships and that phone call that I was supposed to return and my parents are texting me and I don't have time to text them back and I have that assignment due for school, whatever it may be, right? There's just things on things on things, and sometimes our life gets so cluttered and sometimes we have to trust the pruning. Part of remaining is we have to trust the pruning of when God is taking off these moments of our life and saying, I want you to devote energy here, and because you're so focused on this, it's taking away from this thing that I'm actually leading you into. I think the second thing we see is we learn from vine dressers and these analogies of grapes and stems and vines, right, is we have to trust the process. This guy was describing like the actual process, right, of a vine dresser, right, as he plants this little stem into the ground until it grows, until it becomes mature, until he sees this little bud on it, and that bud begins to sprout and become a mature grape that it can actually be used and put in the wine press, right? He says from start to finish, it's about a 3-year process. Kind of interesting that Jesus with the disciples, for people think 3 years, right? It's this long process of it's not overnight. Sometimes we have to trust the process that is taking place. They say a good bottle of wine, right? It's supposed to be 9 to 13 years before you actually drink it, and I don't know that because I don't get the good stuff, right? Mine is not 9 to 13 years old, right? But it's this long process of maturation. It's the idea that maybe we're in this season and we don't know where God is at and we don't know what it looks like to remain in God, but we have to trust not only the pruning, but trust the process, because God is at work in us and His process is moving us deeper into maturity. It's moving us deeper into a knowledge of who God is, and it's moving us deeper into an ability to remain and understand what God's love actually is. I think the last thing we see is we have to trust the promise. As Jesus is giving this example to His disciples, He's reminding them that they need to remember the promise of who He, the Son of God, is. That they can remain in His love when they remember who God is. And they remember the promises of Jesus always being with them. And they remember the promise of love God and love people. And it's these promises that Jesus has instilled in them over the last 3 years. And He says, I want you to remember the promise I've given you. So we have to trust the pruning, and we have to trust the process, and we have to trust the promise. And all of this is encapsulated in what it means to remain. And so as we talk about overarching, what does it look like for us to be faithful? As we were kind of that image of that person that we described, that this was a faithful person in my life. Right? We recognize that faithfulness is the motive of obedience. And we're called to be obedient, right, to God's commands, and His commands are not burdensome. And that command is to believe in God and to love His people. And we realize that we can only do this when we first receive and acknowledge God's love, when we remain in God's love. I'm going to wrap us up in a little bit, but I want us to discuss this. Right, we've talked about this broad idea of faithfulness, of obedience, of God's love, of remaining, abiding, abiding, of staying in God's home, in His presence. And so the question is, well, then what does that look like for you? In your life, what do you think it looks like to remain? In your life, what is it going to look like this next week to have moments where you're maybe not so caught up in doing, but you remember to be in the presence of God? Right? Maybe you talk about what does it look like to trust the pruning in your life, and what are the areas that maybe you want to let God prune? What are the reminders you need to remind each other of, hey, this is the process and this is what God is doing in your life, and I can see that, and maybe you speak that over each other. Maybe it's reminding each other in this moment, this is what the promise of God is, and we get to step into that this week. And so take a moment and, again, discuss in your guys' groups this question of what does it look like this week to remain in God's love? To remain, to abide, to abode, to stay in the home of the presence of God. What is it like to trust the process, to trust the pruning, and to trust the promise? So I'm going to break you guys off, and I want us to just talk about it, wrestle with it, real life application. What does this look like to remain for us? So go ahead and do that. I'll bring us back in a little bit. Again, if you're online, if you're still with us, take a moment and write in the chat, because it's going to encourage each other. So take a moment to do that, and I'll bring us again back here in a little bit. Yeah. Some of you guys are still talking a little bit. I love it because this conversation doesn't have to end. And after this, we get to keep sharing these things, right? And I think that's what's beautiful about this space, is we get to have a chance to encourage each other. Right? And that's what discipleship is. It means to be a learner, right? And we get to learn in this space. And so let's not let these conversations end. Let's continue these after. But just want to wrap up with this, though. As we've been talking about God's faithfulness and what it looks like for us to be faithful, what it looks like for us to obey God's commands and to remain, abide, abode, stay in God's home, I just want to close with this little story. Right? And at the very beginning, I threw this picture up on the screen and talked about someone who was faithful. And as you guys all probably could tell, right, it looked pretty similar to me, except the nose is a little bit bigger. Didn't inherit that. That's my grandfather. And so I don't know this person as Lynn Thurkelson. I know this person as Granddaddy. There's a picture, it's kind of hard to see, but there's me and my granddaddy. He passed away in 2012. I was 22 years old. And yeah, I remember these things about my grandfather of, again, what I told you, of this man who was faithful in his everyday moments, who served his country faithfully, who served his family faithfully, who served the Lord faithfully. And yet that's not really what I remember him as. Like I said, I knew him as granddaddy. I remember growing up and going over to his house, and he was really into wood carving, and so he would sit and he'd make ducks, and we would never say anything, but I would just sit next to him, and I remember just watching him work and being fascinated with what he would do with his hands. I remember he had this property up in Northern California along this creek, and I remember when I was little just going over to his house, and we would just quietly walk up and down the creek together and God's beauty and God's nature. I remember when I was little, we'd always get to go walk and check the mail together, and I'd hold his hand, and we'd walk to the end of the street, and we'd check the mail. And whenever I think of my granddaddy, right, he was someone who was present in my life. He was someone who was there. He was someone who I respected. He was someone who I looked up to, and he had his faults, and he had his flaws, and sometimes he was really grumpy and really angry, and sometimes he was kind of an intimidating man to approach, and yet at the core of who my granddaddy was, he was someone who I knew loved me. He was someone who I experienced firsthand his love. He was someone who I look to often when I think of faithfulness, because he was a man who maybe didn't do these big, giant, huge things in our perspective for God. He wasn't always the most effective maybe for God compared to other people, and yet he was obedient to God. He was obedient in the everyday moments of his life, and because of that, he's the greatest depiction of faithfulness to me. And you see here, right, there's his gravestone, and he was buried in a military gravesite, and maybe you can see, it's kind of hard to see at the very bottom there, it says 2 Timothy 4:7. And that was this verse that he wanted to be remembered by. Right, and in 2 Timothy 4:7 here, right, Paul is writing to Timothy, his protege, his younger person who's following him, he's teaching these things, and Paul is saying these words to Timothy, and he says this, he says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. You could summarize that, and instead of putting 2 Timothy 2:4-7, right, you can just put the word faithful right there. And that's who my granddaddy was. He was a man who was faithful because he was obedient. See, God isn't about our effectiveness, he's about our obedience. That's good, I'm going to say it again. God isn't about our effectiveness, he's about our obedience. And when we obediently choose to follow and to believe in him and to love the people around us, like the commandment that he says, obey my commands, and they are not burdensome because I love you. And it's in those moments when we choose to remain in God's love that I think God's love truly gets to be demonstrated through us. This past 2 or so years of my life has been a pretty tough year, and it was a season, a lot kind of goes into it, but it was a season where I found myself questioning where God was and who God was, and a season of darkness, a season of depression in a lot of ways, in many ways, and I found myself looking and knowing who God was and knowing God's faithfulness and God's love, but not fully experiencing it in that season. It was definitely a season of pruning, and a season where I needed to trust the pruning and trust the promise. And I was in it though, and so I didn't see it, and I didn't feel it, and I didn't know where God was. And I remember traveling up north to my older brother's house, and we were talking about stories of granddaddy. And I asked my brother Josh, I said, Josh, do you really have anything of granddaddy's? I don't really have anything to remember him by. And he said, yeah, actually, I do have something. And before he passed, I was kind of going through his house, and we were cleaning up stuff, and he pulled out this little book. He says this book was by granddaddy's bed on his nightstand right next to his bed. He says this was one of the books that was there all the time, and he would often turn to it and he would read it at night before bed. And this book's called The Kneeling Christian. It's simply about sitting in the presence of God and coming before God in prayer. And my brother gave this to me probably like a year ago, and he said, Jordan, I want you to hold on to this. One, to remember granddaddy, but more than that, to remember who granddaddy was. He had his faults and his imperfections. And he was a man who dared to be a kneeling Christian. To remain in God's love and to be obedient to who God was. And now this little book sits on my end table right next to my bed. And I read it to remember who God is and what it means to kneel and to sit and to remain and to abide in God's love. Because that's what faithfulness is. Sitting in the presence of God. And it's the moments where we sit and we allow ourselves to be a human being, not a human doing in the presence of God, that we then get to fully love God and love people. And that's why we can faithfully obey God's commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome because it's rooted out of love and we remain in God's love. And so as we wrap up and as we think in our own lives, what does it look like to be faithful? As we look to the people in our life who are images of faithfulness, may we remember the ultimate picture of faithfulness in God sending his son. And when we take the time to remain and to be with him, then imagine what could happen this week if we simply sat in the presence of God for just a moment and allow that to define our actions and our obedience and our faithfulness.